today, thanks to Stella, to come and talk to us about local adaptations to climate change. I did have a short pre-meeting with her, and the work she's working on a very large project. I guess this is multiple years, and there may be places for us to contribute, right? But I'm gonna let her talk about it because I'm not good at this, and she is.
Hi, everybody. So nice to see everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. And so I think it's a small enough group that we can just have a conversation. And so I'd like to just give you a brief overview of what our office does. Please interrupt me and ask me questions. Anyway, so I'm just going to do a couple of things, tell you what our office does, what our big goals are. And then when Anne and Stella and I had met previously, there was one project that we thought might be applicable to this group. So just a big overview of what we do. I manage the Office of Climate Action, which is a university-wide office. We are located in the president's office. And our primary directive is to help shepherd implementation of the Climate Action Plan, which was adopted by President Holloway in 2021. And so what that means is we have sort of three big headline climate goals, and they are to achieve neutrality by 2040, carbon neutrality by 2040, to implement just sustainable adaptation, and to build a culture of sustainability university-wide. So those are the three big goals. We, as an office, are very small, and so we're not doing a lot of that implementation. We're doing a lot of the organization and coordination and keeping track. So a lot of the tracking the metrics to see where we're doing, how we're doing along that path, as opposed to actually.
Can I interrupt? Do you want us to save questions to the end, or can we?
No, please go ahead.
Could you review the second of your goals, the climate neutral by 2040, and then what was the other one?
Just equitable adaptation, and this is the one that we were talking about that would be applicable probably to this group. So the first goal is really a pledge to not make climate change worse, right? So it's mitigation. The second goal is to say climate change is already happening, it's already impacting us, what do we do about it? And the third one is an acknowledgement that the only way we're going to get to achieve goals 1 and 2 is if we build a culture of sustainability. This can't just be a one and done. This has to be baked into the way we live and the way we think. And so those are our three headline goals. A really good example of what our office does. So for example, I'm not sure if you are on either our Camden, if you've been to our Camden campus, you'll see this too, but around New Brunswick, you all will have seen the solar canopies going up over surface lots. That was done through institutional planning and operation. That's not my office. They did that and we helped support them. And so being an office of like 3.5 people, we're not able to decarbonize the whole university. So we are really a support function and we liaise to the president's office. And so it is a way for us to sort of keep accountability to these goals, both up and down. So up to the president's office where we're located, and down to anyone below that. So whether that's a chancellor unit, a faculty member, a student, a community member, etc. The second sort of like big chunk of things I want to really quickly talk about is the how. So when we talk about climate goals, that's the what we're trying to do. We're trying to achieve neutrality, adapt, and build a culture of sustainability. Pretty basic climate goals that you would see almost anywhere. I think Google has very similar climate goals to that. And so the thing that makes Rutgers distinctive is the core values. And this is the how, right? So it's not just what are we doing, it's how are we planning on doing it. It would be very easy to buy a bunch of carbon offsets and say, okay, we're carbon neutral. That is not the path that we want to take. And so our three core values include climate justice. That's acknowledging that we have legacies of inequality around the environment and that people are impacted differently by climate change that's already happening, and that our solutions must acknowledge and address those inequalities. The second one is civic responsibility. And so this is the idea that anything that we do around climate needs to be done in a spirit of service. So asking how can we be of service to any community to which we claim membership, including New Brunswick. So this idea that we're sort of in this together and how can we work together as a community. And the last one is actionable scholarship. This is acknowledging that there are many things that are unknown about climate action. We don't really know a lot of things about solutions or problems even sometimes. And so as we as an institution are trying to answer those questions through research, we have a duty to do it in a way that is rigorous and transparent and communicative. So as we learn things, we share it with people, and we're doing it through a rigorous academic process. Okay, so that's the what we're doing and how we're doing it. No problem, Amanda. So nice to see you. Nice to meet you virtually. And so the thing that Anne and Stella and I were talking about was the potential for us to be able to talk about that second goal, which is the just adaptation. The idea being from a Rutgers level, each of our 3 physical campuses, so Camden, Newark, and New Brunswick, we are looking, starting this summer, to start building out community resilience plans. And so the question is, how can we as a community be more resilient? And asking the very first question when we ask that is, who is our community? So obviously it's our faculty, staff, and students, but it is also the physical geographic places in which we sit. And it's also the sort of the relationships we have that may be geographically distant. So that's a long way of saying, as we're thinking about how to be resilient, is who are we serving in that resilience, and how can we use some of the resources that are coming from the state and maybe even the federal government to build out plans and implement them in a way that is serving more people. So I'll give you an example of this. One of the things that we're talking about, or that we're asking quite a few questions about, is Resilience Hub. So what does that mean? The question being, is there a place, a physical place? So a Resilience Hub is a physical place that is a hub that would be hardened against our most common sort of shocks. So whether that be flood, wind, loss of power, and then how can we provide what are the most basic needs for community members? So that includes geographically near folks. So that would be New Brunswick, Piscataway, Highland Park, Edison, just thinking about the people that are on both sides of the river. And what is it that people generally need? And it's obviously the number one thing is always electricity. It maybe 60 or 70 years ago, that wasn't the most pressing thing, but right now that's how people get the best information. If you can't charge your phone, there's no way you're getting the best information about what's happening in the world around you. And so it's absolutely crucial now for people to have some source of power. And then depending on how long the shock is, it could include a place to stay overnight. It might be just a meal for a couple of meals a day. And so it depends on what the shock is, but that's the idea of a resilience hub. In order to do that effectively, there's some infrastructure questions, which I think is really Rutgers' responsibility to figure out the infrastructure questions. But there's a lot of sort of community level questions. What are the biggest needs? How could those be met? Are there different populations that have different kinds of needs? Are there different needs that arise after different shocks? So for example, Rutgers, post-Sandy, Rutgers was a hub. And so they were a shelter, a place that folks could shelter. The state had deemed them so. And it has stayed that way since Sandy. And so the idea then is, how can we shore that up, right? So right now, the Livingston housing that was built post-Sandy is a resilience hub, meaning it could be completely off-grid. Now, the first floor of that is a commuter lounge, and the idea is that that commuter lounge could then serve as a sort of a community hub where people could come for a short period of time, if we're talking about probably less than 36 hours, to gather and get what they need. But so then the other questions are, where else can we do that? So does that mean doing it obviously on the other side of the river? Are there multiple places that we could be doing that on both sides of the river? Maybe one closer to College Ave and maybe one closer to the Cook Dug area. So these are all the sorts of questions that we're asking. But in order for us to build the infrastructure around that in a meaningful way, we need to start asking some initial questions about what are the needs and how are those best served and who are the populations that need to be served. I'm going to stop talking because I just sort of like rambled off a huge project, but that's what's on the horizon for us within the next, I'd say, 6 months to start doing in all 3 of our geographic locations. I'd love to hear questions or comments, and I can talk more about the other stuff that our office is doing, but I think that's the project that's probably the most applicable to this group.
Thank you
I
so
think
much,
you also.
I just wanted to say I'm so sorry I'm having camera troubles, but I didn't get to introduce myself quickly, so I don't mean to cut your question off, but I have met a few of you before. I work at Rutgers. Currently, I do fundraising for the school, and I worked with Angie as a student, and now I'm getting to continue this relationship with her. And since getting connected with the Environmental Commission, I thought it could be a really cool way to bridge some of my experience. And yeah, I'm this was such a great conversation. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah.
Yeah, Stella got us Angela to come, and it was Stella's connection here. So thank you,
Stella,
Stella.
we know you. Oh.
Yeah.
So,
but-
yeah, one of the things that what I talked about with you last time that I found very interesting is that this this resiliency includes egress, right? How to get out of here, which, given how many of our roads flood, is a really interesting problem as well. And yeah, so so it's not only supporting people who need a place to stay or to charge their phones or, you know, get out of the cold or the, you know, the floods or whatever, but also communicating how the hell to get out if we need to, right? So,
Well, I think that's actually, I mean, that's a complicated question. So yes, if someone has made the decision, then absolutely. And it's not just complicated from a logistical perspective. I think we saw this, and we see this quite a bit when we're talking about disaster management or emergency management, is this question of evacuation and when do we ask people to do it. I think that we saw people stay in Sandy that shouldn't have, because Irene was the year before that, and they were getting the same messages in Sandy that they got during Irene. And so many people thought, well, Irene wasn't that big of a deal. They were saying all this stuff. It was fine. So they stayed and they shouldn't. So that's one whole piece of how do you communicate and risk, and how do you communicate risk in a way that people are able to make informed decisions for themselves. So that's one whole big piece, which is important, particularly when we're talking about very diverse communities that perhaps speak different languages, have different forms of communication. And so that's a whole question about risk communication. And then the second piece then is, just the logistics of, let's say you've decided that you need to go. The river is a barrier, and I'm just going to include 18 in the river because that's 18 becomes a river very often. And so then what does that mean for folks? And I think that those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. I think what would really be helpful in those conversations is having an indication of where people are going. And so, right, if we're talking about safe routes out, where, right? So where are people trying to go? But these are all conversations that we would have in the planning process. The planning process needs to be deeply engaged with the community so that we can have a meaningful outcome. And so obviously we're not going to solve that here and now. And it will be a long, involved process. And it will also include, like I said, Highland Park and Piscataway and Edison, and probably some East Brunswick as well. So anyway, that is just one of the many projects that we're working on that I think it would be applicable to this group. We have other things that are probably more Rutgers specific, or anyway, we have other things that are probably more Rutgers specific. I will say one of the big questions that's always on the horizon is how do we get folks around campus? And so that means, how do we get folks across the river, not in times of emergency, just in normal times? How do we get people across the river? How do we get them between campuses? And not only is that really awful for our students and faculty and staff, it's also really awful for the residents of all those places, right? So Highland Park and New Brunswick and Piscataway, it's awful. We know that it's awful. So this is a question that it's not just my office. That's a conversation that's happening across our institutional planning and operations group, in conversation with my office. There's a climate component to that, because obviously we're burning fossil fuels in the transportation, but there's also just a quality of life, and are we meeting our academic mission if it takes students 45 minutes to get across the river? Probably not. We're probably not meeting our academic mission if that's what it takes.
I will tell you, as a recent former student, it is unbearable. The buses,
unbearable.
Yeah, really tough. Not just the travel time, but they're crowded. Anyway, may I ask two questions, just very quick? Obviously you're coordinating, Angela, with the municipalities, the government, and other entities within the city that may assist in providing these services or provide these services. So, for example, during Superstorm Sandy, I was working at Lord Sterling School, handing out blankets, helping people get electrical support and things like that. So I'm sure you're coordinating and hopefully liaising with the municipalities that are concerned here. And then the second question is, you were talking about building infrastructure or using existing infrastructures to support this mission?
I think it's okay. So I'll answer those two questions separately. So the first one, all the coordination happens through our Office of Emergency Management, and they have like a command center in there that looks like it came straight out of a movie. I am not the one actually doing this. Again, we have folks across Rutgers that do this way better than I could, and they have an entire team of folks that are doing this. They are working directly with the state, and so they're the ones doing that. So yes, they're deeply dialed in.
If I can speak to New Brunswick specifically, like most municipalities have a master plan, and those include disaster recovery measures and evacuation planning and things like that. So are you plugging into that and coordinating with them? Okay.
Yes. And I will say that in fact, the requirements that are coming down from the state, many of those were written in coordination with our Office of Emergency Management, because I do have, Rutgers is in a unique situation that we have a physical footprint in North, South, and Central Jersey. And so when the state has a question about how, so we basically run small cities in 3 different locations in Jersey, which is, they really are like small cities. So our Office of Emergency Management has the experience in 3 really different contexts. And so they work very closely with the state and rolling out those policies. So yes, I'm not only deeply involved in the operation and implementation of those plans, but often in the policy that shapes how those plans are written.
Okay, right.
Okay.
And then the infrastructure. Yeah, I don't think we get out of this situation without constructing infrastructure. I don't think that's possible.
Oh,
and so yes,
okay.
we have to. We never clean slate anything. We don't get a chance to. My background is as an urban environmental planner, so I'm thinking sort of as an urban planner. You don't get to clean slate anything unless like you're in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and even then there's infrastructure. I practiced in Texas. I'm from Texas. But in Jersey, you don't get to clean slate anything. There's something here already, right? And so you have to work with the existing infrastructure. But I don't think we get out of this. We don't solve any of these big problems without building something. But
really?
Wow. when we're talking about the river, or we're talking about 18, that's really complicated. We've had conversations internally, and also with partners, about building a pedestrian friendly bridge across the river, right? That would be one solution. Like, so a pedestrian / bike / scooter, whatever. So micro mobility bridge across the river. That would require New Brunswick, Piscataway, because the footings would be in different jurisdictions.
Right.
We'd have NJDOT involved in that. Rutgers would have to be involved in that. The number of jurisdictions and sort of authorities to just get a pedestrian bridge across the river is unbelievable. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I do actually think we should very much do that. But the question is not technical. The question is administrative and bureaucratic.
As always,
Amen.
I was thinking more of like, we have the gymnasium on College Ave. We have the football stadium in Piscataway. That could be a huge.
They are. They're set up for both of those things. And so the question is, and so you're exactly right. So, and that's part of the reason the state looks to us, because we just have these physical things that exist. And so there are emergency plans to use those as evacuation centers and hubs as needed. The question is, how can we do it better? So as climate changes, the intensity and frequency with which things happen, our needs are changing. And as our communities shift, are we meeting the needs of that community as it shifts? That takes real-time analysis and coordination and questions to make sure that we're actually doing that. So yes, when you're talking about physical buildings, 100% we're going to use those because we can't. Well, I guess we could build another football stadium, but don't say that to anyone at Rutgers. But there's no point, right? If we have that, then we might as well use it. But the question is, how are we maximizing that asset fully, and then under what circumstances? So what if there's a flood? That's different than if there's extreme heat, which is different than if there's extreme cold. And so each different kind of shock or emergency is going to require a different kind of response. And so it's just a constant checking in to make sure that we are checking all those boxes. And then as climate change is changing the context in which we're operating, we have to ask those questions too. And then you layer on top of that all the social pieces. The people who have a tendency to need the services the most are often the ones that have the most trouble accessing them. Are we reaching those people? Are we reaching them in a way that they understand what is available? And so those are all the sorts of questions that we need to be asking in this process.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yep, absolutely.
really interesting stuff. I found myself thinking about it a lot since we had that conversation. But,
That's wonderful. When we get to the point where we're engaging folks, I mean, the only way a plan is only as good as the stuff that you put into it. And so the more input and perspectives and ideas that we have put into it, the better the outcome is going to be. And again, it's a living document that will have to be updated regularly.
so I'm just curious, how do you get input from the local community? I mean, I can imagine how you get it from Rutgers, but how about from outside Rutgers? How about from the residents of New Brunswick?
Yeah,
Which
well,
we
that's going to be, that's going to be a
Hold on 1
question.
second, I'm sorry.
That's going to be a question that I am not going to answer myself because I don't live in New Brunswick. That's a question that we're going to ask many, many people. It's going to be a combination of reaching out through organizations like this one. It's going to include schools and community groups and faith centers. So reading out to churches, et cetera. And so again, I'm going to sort of put my urban planner hat on. We're going to do the best that we can, and then we're going to modify. Right. So we're going to reach out to all those people and ask them what's the best way to do this. They're going to tell us we're going to try that. It's going to not be perfect, and we're going to have to modify based on how well it works. And so the best that I can say is we're going to have to ask you all to help us answer that question.
I think it would be really interesting to do that. So, but I'm assuming that you're going to have something to start with. I mean, I think our problem is we don't know how to get started, right?
Yeah, so this is all going to be done through.
What's that?
Yeah, so this will all be done through the Office of Emergency Management because they're the ones that have the connections to. I mean, so when you think about the Office of Emergency Management, they're dialed into every single emergency response that you can imagine. Obviously, like fire and all the first responders, but also all of your utilities. So they have to be dialed into all the utilities. They have connections to all the weather services. They have a direct line to the governor's office, right? They have a direct line to the president's office at Rutgers. And so they're the ones that have all those connections to start. And that's the implementation piece of it. So then the question is like, how does it get done? I think that on the front end of it, what I'm talking about is what is the thing that we're trying to do, or what are the things that we're trying to do. And
Right.
so when we go to emergency management, we're going to tell them like, we need these 15 things. And they're like, okay, this is how we're going to figure out how to do that. And so it's all being organized through them because they've done this before. We're just going to add on to this piece that we need to make sure that we're checking the right boxes in the what we're doing.
Angie, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The Office of Emergency Management, is that made up of like planners or like who makes up that office?
So the person who leads it is Steve Kellerman. And I actually don't know what his background is in. I think he's just been doing this forever. Like, I think he may have popped out of the womb being an emergency manager. Like, he's so dialed into it. He just knew. And so I don't know what his background is. I know that you can get a certification in emergency management. I know a lot of urban planners go into this. It's often understanding how the systems work, the systems being like the way a city metabolizes things, whether that's people or resources or moves people around. Planners know that. That's what we study when we're in school. So often planners will go into this. I don't think that's what Steve's background is in.
Okay. Yeah,
I think he's been here for like 30 years.
Wow. Interesting.
Angela, is there one person that heads up emergency management for all the facilities? And by the way,
for Rutgers.
Yeah, for Rutgers.
Yeah.
And by the way, I wanted to say that your planning is including the hospitals, I would imagine, right, too?
Yes. Well, so yes. And so this is really interesting because so again, going back to all the solar panels that we put in, one of the things that we've realized is that they're overproducing, which is a wonderful problem to have. But rather than having that overproduction sort of water down the drain, so to speak, we are looking at installing batteries to store it for those store it when we're overproducing to use later when the sun is down and we're underproducing. But one of the questions that we're asking is where can we strategically locate that storage to places that either absolutely have to have power in an emergency situation and or to these resilience hubs. So obviously hospitals have a different situation. So any clinical setting has sort of that emergency level where there are certain things that don't go off. Right, so there's certain things that they're going to have a backup generator. I think this is all required to be in a clinical setting. they'll have a generator that comes on that is going to support certain things, right? So you can imagine what those things are. This is so yes for the hospitals, but another thing to think about for Rutgers is some of our research labs. So some of our research labs have samples in them that have been there forever, right? So
Herbarium.
anyway, so
The herbarium is one.
yes, exactly. But so when you think about the same, and I'm talking about like tiny little samples that are in giant refrigerators that are in labs, that if
Right.
those were to lose power during the duration of a storm, we would lose years and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research. And so obviously those are sort of high asset places that we're going to be looking at also. So yes, it is not they're not broad brushstrokes. We're being very intentional about how we're looking at these moments of shock and what are our highest priorities, obviously clinical settings. Just a note, the hospital is not owned by Rutgers. And so we don't operate it. That's Robert Wood Johnson, that's Barnabas operates it. And so we lease space there. We don't have control over their function. I will say that Barnabas is going. What's that?
It says Rutgers. It says Rutgers on the hospital. That's the only reason I put it up.
It does.
Robert Wood Johnson in New Brunswick is Rutgers, is it not?
Yes, but we don't own the building, right? And so.
Oh, I see. I got you. Yes.
And so, but what I will say is that so we lease that space. We don't own that space, which means we don't have control over that building.
Right.
And so Barnabas and Robert Wood Johnson merged, and they're going through an extensive climate action planning process right now. The chair of one of the co-chairs of our Rutgers Health Climate Action Group is also chairing that process. So there's, although they are separate, we are really dialed into the work that we're doing, and we're in constant communication. And so again, it's very bureaucratic, but because we have really good relationships and we're in constant communication, that is being done in partnership with the folks at Rutgers. And so that is a complicated way of saying we don't have ultimate control over that, but we are in conversation with them throughout the process. And we're hoping that plan gets delivered soon. So they are also thinking about these same things.
Off of Stella's question, is there one person that heads up emergency management for all Rutgers facilities, or is there someone at each campus, let's say?
So both and. So there's, I mean, in the same way that you have a chancellor on each campus. So,
Sure.
Rutgers, New Brunswick, Camden, Newark all have separate campuses, and they each have a chancellor, but we have a president. It's the same thing for emergency management. And so we have emergency managers on each of our campuses, and we also have a director who oversees all of that. Now, the director works primarily with the state, and he oversees the campus level folks. But so it's both and.
Okay, great, thanks.
So I want to say something. I want to get a little bit away from emergency management and talk about the fact that my understanding is that Rutgers has a hell of a lot of knowledge about one of the, we talked before about how the fact that our biggest problem is flooding, right? Where, yes, we can have fires, and yes, we can have other things, but the most likely to hurt us is flooding. And Rutgers has done a lot to exacerbate the problem. Right? I mean, the whole Honors College building there is a bit of a problem. I mean, they worsened the flooding on 18 there. So, and it's not for lack of knowing what to do. It's just right hand, left hand, I think. I don't get how that. It just seems to me that some of these plans are not reviewed by, and this construction is not reviewed by people who are worried about climate change, right, and the environment. Just putting that out there, I don't know what there is to do about it. I mean, these are. But there needs to be somebody, this needs to be a check that, to stop that stuff, right? We have too much impervious surfaces. We have too much development, too much runoff, too much, culverts that don't hold the water, right? Sewage that's overflowing. Yeah. So,
So if I can just share my perspective on that and maybe what I have seen in the time of working, like being a student at Rutgers, I think
mhm,
it took a while for the momentum to build enough so that
I think that's
Rutgers
true.
really started to pay attention to this and take it more legitimately as an issue. Um,
I agree.
so, but I don't really understand those intricacies of the university, but I think, now it's kind of the attitude of like, it's all hands on deck. Like, let's figure this stuff out.
Yeah, and I
Um,
read recently, one of the local newspapers, that they are doing an amazing retrofitting the buildings for
mm,
just the lighting and the heating and cooling, and they're expecting to save tens of thousands of dollars a month on this by just getting more efficient. So
yeah,
that's all good news, right?
I think
They're
that's
paying
so
attention,
exciting.
and it's in their interest to pay attention. So
Yeah, it's of course. And but like, I think it's also important that the university is like interacting with that feeling because, we're our home base is New Brunswick.
right.
And so it's in all of our best interests to like work together towards that kind of solution. So I think then I don't want to interrupt anybody else if anybody had a question or comment. So please interrupt me if I am. But what I was talking about with Angie and Anne, we were talking in our earlier meeting was about, a project for the commission to adapt and something that kind of fits within your existing framework. And I think what we had landed on, from my understanding, was maybe thinking about some kind of policy to help push for impervious surfaces. And I'm not super familiar with the type of work that you have all done in the past, so I don't know if this is, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that, and please chime in.
Well, the state's way ahead of us. I mean, the state is demanding that we address this, but NJDEP. And one of the things that when we review the tech packets, I think is very important for us is to look at the impervious surface cover. We look at every development, for every variance that's asked for in the city. This is very hard though. I mean, some of the ones that I looked at this week, the problem is they're saying this is existing infrastructure, like we can't make this building smaller. It exists, this is not, where do you want us to go? And if we're renovating the building, we're not going to make it smaller. So I get that, right? But I think we really need to hold the line and to be really adamant about saying, no, you cannot add to it. And you need to, all new construction really needs to do something with cisterns or with, storage, right? Or slowing down the absorption of the water, right? We've got to do that. And, there's and rain gardens and all of that kind of stuff. It's small, but they have a cumulative effect. They work.
Yeah, they
right?
do. They really do. And
So,
that's why you guys did that project.
So these are small things that we can certainly advocate for, right? And I think we do. So
Yeah.
right.
So do you all
I
work
love the
with-
fact that you're overproducing the electricity with these solar arrays that are going up everywhere. So this is a stupid question. It's not an environmental question, but it's getting to be there, right? More and more people have electric vehicles. And when the power goes out, if you're living at home, you can't charge your car. So what's going to happen there? I just, I have an EV and it's just occurred to me, oops, what happens if we have no power?
All right, is that a question for me?
Kind of. I mean,
I think
you
it
know,
depends
it's not the same thing as charging my phone.
I think it depends on your situation. And again, I think it depends on, I don't think there's a universal answer, because I can imagine lots of situations where if you don't want to flee and you want to shelter in place, that your car is actually an asset because you can actually charge your phone from your car. And so again, if we're just talking about
Assuming it has to
24
charge. Right.
well, I also have an EV. Most people can charge their phone from their car battery unless it's on
Yes,
like
yes,
absolute zero.
absolutely.
And so,
Right.
like, if you have any charge in your car, you can charge your phone. And so, again, it depends on
Right.
the severity, the duration, all those sorts of things. So, if we're just talking about a nor'easter coming in and it's like 36 hours, then it's probably an asset to have an EV, right? Like, so if you have thought ahead and charged your car, you have access to some power,
Right.
which a lot of people don't. And if you have a huge car like a Lightning, you can actually get the converter that your car can act as a generator for your home. I mean, it costs a little bit of money to have that interface installed. But if
Yeah.
that's something, if you live in a place where that happens, that's an option. Now, again, if you need to flee, then you have to think ahead and charge your car in the same way that people that have combustion engines have to think to go to the gas station and put fuel in their car. And so,
Right.
yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're right. But hopefully that would not be the case. And I do think that for most of the events that we're seeing, they're not going to last, with the exception of things like Sandy, which, you know, I lived in Highland Park and I had to go to Philadelphia because I didn't have hot water for a week. And I didn't have power for a week. I was the one street in Highland Park that didn't have power for a week. And so
Wow.
in those situations, you have to leave, right? So there's no question.
Yes.
But for most of our incidences, they're usually, we're looking at like 24 to 36 hours. And in that case, a vehicle battery can actually be an asset. So again, really
Right.
context specific.
Yeah.
Well, right. Having the car charged is I think one of the concerns there. So I know you have a few refueling stations here in New Brunswick. You said you're not in the New Brunswick area, but on Cook campus, there's a refueling station. You pull up your van or whatever, your Rutgers van, you take out the nozzle from the pump and you pump your own gas. Would something like a recharging station could that be considered something to be installed there to facilitate charging of EVs?
Yeah. So
That
Rutgers
type-
right now is,
I'm not asking you specifically, is that on your agenda, but that type of thinking, I think, is, especially if you have surplus electrical supply, right?
so I'm not sure you're not asking me if that's what we're doing.
Charging is,
I can
if
tell
there's
you
an
what we're
emergency-
doing.
I'm sorry?
I can tell you what we're doing, but so if there's an emergency, you're not going to be able to charge your vehicle in that amount of time anyway. So
Right.
like, hopefully we're thinking ahead and people are charging their cars in advance. Just like you would, I don't know, go buy groceries and
Right. Like
What's
the
that?
mad rush to the supermarkets to buy bottled water and stuff like that. That always happens.
yes. And so,
Right? Yeah.
and also just the amount of time it takes to charge your vehicle. If you're at a level 2 charger, that's not going to happen depending on your car. Like I have the slowest charging car on the planet. And so that's going to take me 10 hours. And so that's not something that's going to happen at a weigh station, right?
Right.
Yeah.
If you have a level 3 charger, then that can happen in 45 minutes. But the reality is we're not installing a bunch of level 3 chargers. So anyway, so what I will tell you is that yes, it require some advanced planning. Yes, these are all things that we're talking about. I do also want to say that we just signed a contract to purchase 48 electric vehicles over the next 2 years. And so we're installing infrastructure for those vehicles for institutional planning and operations. And on top of that, so that's really inward facing. We understand that there's a huge unmet demand for EV chargers beyond just the fleet that the university uses. And so we've sent out already an RFI to sort of figure out what it would take. What would it take to put in significant level 2 EV charging infrastructure around? And so again, this isn't just New Brunswick, it's New Brunswick and Piscataway and Highland Park and Edison. So what would that take, right? Because it's not just installing the chargers. It's maybe it requires putting in a new panel. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we need a new substation. We can't just put in the chargers. And so we have to figure out what would it take.
There's a really big issue in New Brunswick because a lot of people, I am in the minority, I think, in the sense that I have a garage. And of course, the apartments have garages and there are charging stations in the big garages. But a lot of people have no garage, they park on the street. And how do you charge an EV on the street? What you do is you run an extension cord out, and there's a lot of problems with that. So I don't know.
I live in an apartment now, and yes, that is the life I live. And so, and it's not just that, it's also thinking about our students who are, living away from home. Maybe they live in the dorms. So there's just
Right.
lots of different, the idea is, again, this goes back to the culture of sustainability. We don't want the ability to charge your car to be a hindrance for you converting to an EV. So
Right.
the big thing that holds people back is range anxiety. The more chargers there are, the lower your range anxiety. And so that's the sort of question that we're trying to ask ourselves. But again, it's not as easy as just plopping in a bunch of chargers. It is figuring out what's that going to do to our electrical infrastructure, and where do we have to harden it to be able to take that additional.
Yep.
It's a huge burden. It's a huge stress on that electrical infrastructure. So where do we need to harden it to be able to install, I don't
Yes.
know, 100 new EV chargers? And so there's an RFI out right now for that. And so we're hoping within the next year or two to have that completed. But it's an ongoing question. But in the process of doing that, we're thinking about resilience. So obviously, if there's a storm coming in, the more chargers there are, the more people can think ahead and charge their car, even if they don't have a private charging situation. And so that just the easier that process is.
Yeah, I think that's right. The range anxiety is related to the ability, how easy it is to charge. So.
Yep.
All right. And I think it's a very hard problem in places like New Brunswick. I think it's easier I'm going to guess, in Piscataway, where I'm going to guess a much higher percentage of people have a garage, right? They charge at home, right? And they're not running an extension cord out across the sidewalk into the street, right? They're not parking on the street. That's a really big problem here. So, particularly in certain neighborhoods. Anyway, it's an interesting thing to think about, and I don't know what the answers are. I don't even know where to look on that, but it has been occurring to me that we got to do something. So when you say Rutgers is buying 48 electric vehicles, is that mass transit vehicles, or is that just?
No, that's
not
just
the
our
buses.
fleet.
What?
No, so we did purchase, I think it was 3 electric buses for Newark. New Brunswick, we have all sorts of special problems or special concerns to think about the buses. The primary issue is load and cold. So in the dead of winter, when we have students packed in those buses like sardines, we're carrying the heaviest loads of any buses in all of New Jersey. To the extent that we're working with Edge Transit on a research project to figure out how is it even feasible to get a bus that to run at the same capacity. So even if a bus could carry that load, what does that do to the battery? So let's say we have a diesel bus and it can run, I'm going to make this up, 100 loops on 1 tank of gas, right? So that decreases the number of times they have to stop for gas. Maybe they can run half a day, a whole day. If you have a bus that's carrying that same load in the middle of January and it's super cold, which is awful for batteries,
Right.
how many times can they make a loop before they have to recharge? And does
And take
that
them out of
shortened
service.
loop mean that we have to buy? Well, does it mean that we have to buy more buses? Right? And
Right.
so it's not a question of not wanting to electrify the buses. It's that the technology is not on par at the electric level. So one of the things that we're looking at is maybe we need to be looking at hydrogen. So we're doing quite a bit of research, and the issue is that we just have our loads are too heavy and we get cold. If we were in Arizona, it might not be a problem. We might be able to figure it out. But in January, what do we do when we have 70 kids packed into a bus?
Right.
We don't know. We don't know how to make that work.
Isn't that gas on the table? Throw gas on the table? Or?
What's that?
What?
Natural gas on the table. Are you looking at natural gas run buses?
That's not.
But that's still a
green.
fossil fuel. Why would you do
Yeah.
that? Like
Right.
we're
Why
looking
do
to
we-
go to renewables. Like
Right, but if
we
it's,
don't want to go. We
Let-
don't want to.
okay, well, hydrogen has to be manufactured somewhere, and that's going to take some
Yes.
kind of fossil fuel, most
Yes.
likely. Okay, so we're looking at
Right.
Go ahead.
We completely understand life cycle. We understand fuel source, and so that's why
Yeah, they're
we're trying to figure all this out.
right.
maybe some of the solution is not having to go across the river so much of the time.
They tried that, and they did that with course blocking, and it was an absolute disaster.
Yeah, I
And so what they did, they tried doing this robo scheduling. And again, the question of academic mission, we want students to cross the river. We want them to
Yes.
take classes in other schools. We want them to interact with other people. And so, I mean, anyway, I feel like I've monopolized your meeting at this point, but I'm happy to talk about any of these things. So yes, we love your input. We would love to hear what you all have to say. And so this is sort of what we're working on right now. And, you know, the more brains on the problem, the better. So happy to sidebar with anybody after the meeting if they want to talk about any of these projects, or if they have any ideas. Happy to hear it. Happy to have the conversation.
Okay, I think this is great. Do you want to give us maybe in the chat or something like that a way? Do you have a website where stuff is being
Yes.
posted that we can? And for some reason, I can't find the chat. I got it.
And you can also just email me directly.
Okay. Okay, so we have that. Glenn, you got that for our minutes? Glenn?
Yes. Yeah, I told you it was going to take me a second because I have to unmute, but yes.
Okay, good. Perfect. All right. I think we can let Angela go, and Stella, I really appreciate this. I think this is really interesting stuff. And I would like to kind of stay in touch over time, see where this goes. I don't have any really specific ideas about what we can, get out there on the street and start doing today, but I think there's a lot of food for thought here.
Yeah.
All right.
And
Thanks so
let's
much, everybody.
definitely-
And please feel free to follow up.
Thank you.
Yeah. And let's definitely reconvene at some, and I would love to talk with you about some of the
Excellent.
takeaways from today. And yeah, thank you
Very
so much.
good. Okay, so
Thanks for
yeah,
having me.
you and I have each other's email address. We can do that, and great, excellent. I really do appreciate it.
All right.
This
Thanks,
was great.
everybody.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Good night.